Welcome everyone to San Jose Public Library's fourth and concluding segment of the Yiddish Book Center's Coming to America Reading Groups for Public Libraries, Tales of the Immigrant Experience, a book discussion group, and so much more. My name is Deborah Estreicher. I am one of the librarians at King Library, San Jose Public Library. Next slide, please. 3 Yiddish works in translation were presented chronicling the Jewish experience of immigration to the United States before, during, and after the Second World War. Our fourth selected work, The Refugees by Viet Thanh Nguyen, we bring to you today reflective of the experiences of the Vietnamese community, a major treasured and dynamic immigrant community at home in San Jose today. Our wish was to share and discuss the history, the literature, the timeless universality with varying stories of the immigrant refugee experience live at King Library over tea and cookies. As we can see from our own experiences within these past few months, stability is never guaranteed. Next slide, please. SJPL, San Jose Public Library, is so proud and honored to bring to you today in conversation Viet Thanh Nguyen, Nicole Brada-Williams, Peter Nathaniel Malae, with ASL interpretation by Genevieve Essay and Farah Nolan Black of Purple. Next slide. Okay, take it away, Noelle.
Okay, I'll just say a little bit more about our authors that we're blessed with here today. Viet Thanh Nguyen is the author not only of the short story collection, The Refugees, which came out in 2017, but of the 2016 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Sympathizer, as well as the nonfiction work, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, and the edited collection, The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives. Although the book that first had a big impact on my life was his 2002 work of scholarship, Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America, from Oxford University Press in 2002. He is currently the Errol Arnold Chair of English and Professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. He's in conversation today with Peter Nathaniel Malae, who is the author of the novel Son of Amity, 2018, Our Frail Blood, 2013, What We Are, 2010, which is set in San Jose, and the short story collection Teach the Free Man, 2007. A former Steinbeck Fellow, he was also a McDowell Arts Silicon Valley and Oregon Literary Arts Fellow. In addition to these honors, Peter was also my student in classes at San Jose State University, and I believe it was English 169, Ethnicity and American Literature, which I'm teaching right now this summer, and English 101, Intro to Literary Criticism and Theory. And I always think if I taught Race and Resistance in that class, he might have actually learned to love scholarship and not go into writing. So I always, I take partial credit for you leaving the academy and embracing writing.
Bad pupil.
Viet, you've spoken before about the differences between refugees and immigrants, and I was wondering if you could speak more about, actually, if both of you could speak more about the impact that either being a refugee or an immigrant has had on your characters.
Well, thanks, Noelle, and I just want to say thanks to Peter for joining us in this conversation. I read Peter's novel, What We Are, a couple of years ago and was blown away by that novel. Because it's a novel, it's like the great American novel about San Jose. And I grew up in San Jose and never could have imagined writing about San Jose. My time here was, my time in San Jose was rather challenging. So to see somebody write this novel that I really loved about San Jose was amazing. So I'm really grateful for Peter that he's here. And then when I discovered that Peter went to my high school, it was even better. Like I thought, oh, we were living these parallel lives at Bellarmine College Preparatory and must have been experiencing some of the same things for us to produce What We Are and The Sympathizer, which have some similarities. And maybe some of the similarities came from our backgrounds, and this, addresses your question, Noelle, about refugee and immigrant experiences. But, to call yourself an immigrant in the United States today, it can be challenging, because we're living at a moment of extreme xenophobia against immigrants in this country, which is a cyclical pattern in American history. So there have been times when we embrace immigrants, and been times when we reject immigrants, and this is one of those times for a substantial number of Americans. But even so, the idea of the immigrant is a part of the American dream. We continually return to this idea that this country has been made by immigrants, and that immigrants rejuvenate the country. So there is still support for this idea of the immigrant in our country from a lot of people. Refugees, however, are a different category. We normally do not talk about refugees. The idea of refugees is not a part of the American dream rhetorically. And refugees, I think, are considered by many Americans to not be Americans, fundamentally so. Because I remember when Hurricane Katrina happened, tens of thousands of Americans were displaced, including a lot of Vietnamese refugees who had settled in New Orleans. And some of the American media called these displaced people refugees. And President George Bush said it's un-American to call these people refugees. And for perhaps the only time in history, Jesse Jackson agreed with George Bush, because there are a lot of African Americans among these displaced people. And Jesse Jackson said it's racist to call African Americans refugees. So there is something about the refugee that many Americans feel is not compatible with the American experience, specifically the American dream, because we're a country that's supposed to be exceptional, supposed to be better than other places. We cannot produce refugees, because refugees are a sign of collapse in a society. And so I think it's very important for me, who was a refugee, to continue to call myself that, to write a book called The Refugees, to work with refugee experiences and to foreground those experiences and to claim them, because there are so many refugees who disavow being refugees, either deliberately or just intuitively. They understand that it's better to call themselves immigrants. So I feel like it's crucial for those of us who have been refugees to stand up, to acknowledge that part of our experiences, and to stand up for other refugees. And in particular, I think it's crucial to do that today, because anti-refugee feeling is even higher than anti-immigrant feeling in this country. Whether those are people who are officially classified as refugees by the UN, or by people who are in fact refugees, but who we don't call refugees, like people coming from south of our border into this country. I mean, many of them are refugees from drug wars and totalitarian governments that the United States has sponsored. And so this is the other dimension of refugees that I think makes Americans extremely uncomfortable, because we have to ask, why have these people become refugees in the first place? And in many circumstances, the refugees coming to this country are refugees because the United States helped to produce them with American foreign policy. And so, one way to talk about refugees is to sort of just tone down this difficult political history and to call them immigrants. I don't do that. I explicitly try to connect the refugee experience not to the American dream narrative, but to the narrative of American involvement overseas, so that we can understand that refugee stories are oftentimes, almost always in fact, war stories. That the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian refugees from Laos and Cambodia who came to this country, for example, did not come here as happy immigrants who wanted to come to the United States. They were forced to come because of American involvement in their countries. And these refugees are survivors of war. For Americans, I think they often think of war stories through their soldiers, and Americans have the luxury of fighting almost all of their wars overseas and being able to separate war from the rest of American life. For many refugees, that separation of war from their lives is not possible. And so the community that I know most intimately, the Vietnamese refugee community, when I was growing up in San Jose, was a war traumatized community. And so the refugees, the collection tries to address both the civilian and everyday aspect of being a refugee, but also to be very cognizant of connecting those experiences to what happened in Vietnam and the American role there.
Thanks. Of your 8 stories in the Refugees, nearly all depict parent-child relationships or sibling relationships. And I was wondering, are familial relationships an inevitable part of writing a refugee story?
What do you think, Peter?
Well, I've never written a refugee story, but as you were, God, I was thinking about so many different things as you were talking. That I was remembering an exhibit that I'd seen at the San Jose Art Museum by a Vietnamese artist named Long Nguyen called. Did anybody ever see that? Called, Tales of the Yellow Skin, and he it was an exhibit where he I guess he was trained as an expressionist artist, and it was one of the he was really inducing anyone who hadn't had that experience to know what it felt like, as close as you could get insofar as art goes, which of course is a discussion in and of itself. But it was God, man. I thinking back on it, it was just one of the. I think it's the greatest exhibit I've ever seen, the art exhibit I'd ever seen, and it was because of the experience itself, which I think he captured as best you could as an artist. I don't know, Noelle, your question was about family relationships, but I was just wandering into the San Jose Art Museum, remembering that experience.
Well, actually, I know the artist, Long Nguyen.
Long Nguyen, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm friends with him. And in fact, Tales of Yellow Skin, I think it was number 34 in the series that I chose for the cover of my book, Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America.
Okay.
Yeah, so check out
I've never read it
online, Tales of Yellow Skin, because it's grotesque.
Yeah, it's grotesque. It's the macabre. That's what I was going to say. It's the macabre. And there are skull. You know, I remember seeing he'd taken a bed spring, or a bed, I should say, and then he turned it into a boat. You know, in which skulls were skulls of all of the people who died were sort of woven into the into the fabric of the bed springs, and man, that it was really he enforced on the viewer a very intense experience wherever you came from or whatever your experience had been, which seems to me to be the advantage of art in the first place, and even of literature. You know, that's one of the things that is so important. You know, when I'm going through your stories here in the Refugees, I love the way the stories connect people, actually. You know, in the first story, you have an immigrant who's a refugee who's a ghostwriter, but she's writing this story about someone who eventually, you learn in the story, has similar loss and similar grief, and you don't anticipate it quite, because the story is so deeply saturated with the refugee's experience and the intensity of that experience, and the you know, the way it's searing at a molecular level, and you don't think necessarily that someone perhaps might be able to relate to that. But that's the whole point of literature, or among many points, is that sort of bringing together of seemingly disparate experiences to at least minimally tie to another human being, and say, this really is a human being, and this is a true story, and perhaps there's something in it that I can connect to, you know.
Well, you know, I know Long and the artist Long Nguyen, and it's a very nice guy, very pleasant guy and everything. So when you see his work, it's really shocking, because Tales of Yellow Skin features a lot of grotesque imagery of skulls and body parts and things like this. And I think, you know, the reason why is, as I mentioned, you know, refugees come from traumatized backgrounds. In order to be a refugee, you almost by definition had to survive a terrible experience. And for a lot of Vietnamese and Southeast Asian refugees, what that means is not just war, but that the flight out of their countries on boats or through minefields and things like this was devastating. And so that's manifested in his work. But I just want to stress that disjunction between how people who have been refugees might present themselves and what actually happened in their lives. Because you cannot, I mean, let me tell you something, there's no quicker way to kill a cocktail party conversation than to say, I'm a refugee. because most Americans have no idea what that means and what to say to you when you say you're a refugee. If you say you're an immigrant, they'll say, oh yeah, tell me about your wonderful immigrant story, about your parents from Lithuania and how you're a lawyer now, blah, blah, blah. You say you're a refugee, people know there's some difficulty there, and they don't know necessarily how to talk about it. So I think a lot of refugees learn how to gloss over these difficult experiences. They know they can talk about it maybe with other refugees. So for example, with Vietnamese refugees, for example, if you were not traumatized, that would be interesting. If nothing bad happened to you, that would be unusual. But everybody I know left people behind. Many people, literally lost people, things like that. And that was the normal part of the refugee experience, and it still is. I for example, went to give a talk in Boise, Idaho, a couple of years ago to a high school, to a refugee program of dozens of students who were all refugees. That was the topic of their program, to help them, adjust to the United States. So I thought I'd start off with an easy question, and I asked them, how many of you are refugees? Almost nobody raised their hands. Then I asked them, how many of you are immigrants? Then they started to raise their hands. So these kids who'd been here a year or two already knew that the refugee narrative or idea was not compatible with their American lives. And then they were also writing their own stories, and it was actually very moving to me to read what these 15 or 16-year-old kids were writing about what they had experienced. Because I know they were not going around sharing these experiences probably with their classmates who were not refugees, white kids in Boise, Idaho. But when given the chance to write something, then some of these terrible things started to come out. And then to go back to Noelle's original question, I think, yes, a lot of it is about family relationships, because, that's what you're left with as a refugee. You're left with, how you deal with the outside world and your classmates and your workmates. But otherwise, a refugee life is very constrained. You're oftentimes either living in isolation because you're a refugee family in Boise, Idaho, and Idaho is like 87% white. Or in the case of San Jose, you create a community as the Vietnamese refugees did, and it's a very insular community. You could spend your entire life in a Vietnamese refugee community, never speak English, never go outside of the Vietnamese enclave. And so then it's all about familial relationships within the family, but also, the community as a whole becomes the family. And that is reassuring on the one hand, as families can be, but also, families can be very difficult places, especially if your family has been traumatized, if people are unable to cope with their trauma, if people cannot communicate with each other because parents have one language and American-raised kids have another language. And so, the family becomes a site of both comfort and also, unfortunately, terrible strife for a lot of refugees too.
I wanted to ask you both about creating mixed race characters, since that's something you have in common. But I think now that we're talking about trauma, I think we should refer to Con Russo's question, which I think is very relevant here. She says, many older refugees and immigrants don't learn about the Black experience. For example, my mom, who was a Vietnamese political refugee in 1980, did not know that African Americans came to America as slaves. When she took a US history class and learned that, she was distraught. How can we better inform refugees and immigrants of the past so that they can better empathize with the Black experience?
Peter, do you want to try to tackle that first?
Okay.
Easy one.
I always return to literature. So, for instance, I don't know if you've ever read Viet Langston Hughes's. He has a short essay called Bebop. You read that?
Yeah.
It's a kind of a cool little essay of his. As a poet, he brings a lot of language to the essay, which sometimes is not found in certain essays' work. But in it, he describes where the term bebop came from, which was a term among African Americans in the early 20th century who were describing getting bopped on the head by cops. And so he basically tells the difference between, or he articulates the difference, I should say, between bebop and rebop. Rebop was was the white version of Bebop. And the joke in the essay is basically that that Rebop, having been adapted by white musicians, had lost the sort of real story, the real juice of the Bebop, whose etymology had gone to, or had started with abuse of African Americans by the cops, and it's kind of a crazy essay to read because of the casual way in which Hughes tells the story, which of course is consistent often with people who've suffered. If you've suffered something, then you either you have many options, of course, as a human being. But I think that people tend to either mourn or immerse themselves in that story, or you can make light of it and sort of conceal the pain. You see that in Jewish narratives from the middle of the 20th century, where Jewish humor had a lot to do with living with the atrocities of the middle of the century. Human beings deal with it in all kinds of different ways, but in literature, there's a special way of processing it, I'd say. Even in Richard Wright's Black Boy and some of his stuff, also from the early middle part of the 20th century, you can't really read those books without thinking that there's a problem here, and it's likely, especially then, something that's built into the story, and so I would advocate literature being a means to discovering a story, and the story of the country, etc.
So I just put up the link to my Facebook author page where for the last few days, there's been a pretty vigorous conversation there, prompted by my posts about the question that was just asked by Con Russo about, how do we get, Vietnamese refugees, the first generation and their children specifically, but to talk about Black Lives Matter and to talk about their connection, the connection of immigrant or refugee experiences to the experiences of African Americans in this country. And I think, it's not just unique to Vietnamese refugees, but I'll just talk from that example. And in the post that I've been engaged with, I just basically lost my temper with Vietnamese people, because there is a really strong anti-Black component of Vietnamese American culture. Honestly, there are a lot of racist Vietnamese people. There are a lot of racist Vietnamese attitudes. And I don't think Vietnamese people are unique in this regard. It's just simply that I take it very personally because I'm Vietnamese too. And I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community. And I heard a lot of these kinds of, derogatory comments made by Vietnamese people. And apparently in today's environment, the contemporary moment, it's even worse. That Donald Trump has really been embraced by a lot of Vietnamese American people, particularly of the first generation, but also some of the second generation as well. And there's various explanations for why that's the case. Maybe Vietnamese people, some like strongman politics, like, weirdly coming from an anti-communist place, somehow gravitate towards dictatorial leaders, of which there were plenty in South Vietnam as well. Maybe they like his anti-Chinese stance and so on and so forth. But regardless, all of this is exacerbated by the fact that there's Vietnamese language media that reinforces these kinds of perceptions. So I take to heart Peter's, stance that literature and the cultivation of empathy through literature for other people's experiences is absolutely important. And I think that does work for American-born and American-raised immigrants and refugees like Vietnamese Americans. Many Vietnamese Americans of the younger generation are embracing and supporting Black Lives Matter, or just in general issues of racial diversity and multiculturalism and so on. But that's because they were raised here. They have more of an awareness of what's taking place within the United States, the history of the United States. They read in English, as Peter is talking about. But for that portion of the Vietnamese community that reads in Vietnamese and again has a very insular world in that regard, it's really difficult to talk to them for those of us who are on the outside of that. And so, I just basically said, I'm so fed up with them, because part of the problem, for first and second generation people is that oftentimes there's not just a cultural disconnection or conflict, but also a communication problem. At least for Vietnamese refugees, the tendency for older people is to basically talk down to younger people and talk at younger people. And if we protest, if we bring up other issues, almost always the response is, you're naive, you're inexperienced, you don't know anything. That's the best set of responses. The worst set of responses is, you're a communist, or you're a communist dupe. If you're against Trump, you're a socialist or a communist. If you're for Black Lives Matter, you're a socialist or a communist. It's really hard to have a conversation with people who are taking up that kind of a position, especially across a language barrier as well. Nevertheless, there are younger Vietnamese Americans out there who are doing their best. On my Facebook author page, I put up links to progressive Vietnamese organizations. I put up translated documents of Vietnamese Americans, writing in English and then translating to the Vietnamese, explaining the history that Peter's talking about, our connection to civil rights and Black power in this country, the fact that African Americans helped to support and welcoming Vietnamese refugees and Cambodian and Laotian refugees to this country at a time when the majority of Americans did not want to accept Southeast Asian refugees. There are various slides translating Black Lives Matter arguments into Vietnamese. So it's out there, and people are trying their best to make these changes happen, but the depth of racism and stubbornness in the Vietnamese American community is high. And, we as Vietnamese Americans have to take responsibility for that, either to try to change our communities or basically just disavow them and say they are wrong, and that we who believe in Black Lives Matter and other socially progressive causes are just going to, we're going to fight for them on our own, and we're going to ignore what our elders say if our elders are wrong. We can respect our elders, respect the traumas that they've been through, respect their sacrifices, and we can still think they're wrong and fight for justice in this country.
Just noticed in the chat, Dr. Revati Krishnaswamy pointed out that Toni Morrison notes that becoming American requires assimilating into the racist hierarchy that places Blacks at the bottom. This is also why Afro-pessimism calls out non-white anti-Black racism. In this context, how is it possible to build bridges or solidarity between different minority groups? And one of the things that made me think of this too when you were talking was that it just seems so appropriate that this is being sponsored by the Yiddish Book Center. Because like right now in my own class, I'm teaching Abraham Kahan's Yakel, which is about, well, he was the editor for more than half a century of the Jewish Daily Forward, and one of the most important, or like the most important Yiddish journalist in America. But he also spent, had time off that he would write in English. But so often, both the Jews of the late 19th century and Asian immigrants of the post-1965 generation are often held up as kind of model minority myth. And I'm wondering, how do you deal with these kind of false representations of, somehow immigrants or refugees as capable or like showing, proving somehow that America is free of racism as a way to kind of, a wedge against African Americans, but yet at the same time, these structures, do enable a certain amount of assimilation for refugees that native, that indigenous African Americans don't get access to.
I just want to mention, Peter, I don't know if you've talked about this yet, but you are of Samoan background. Your novel, What We Are, has a half Samoan narrator. And, the questions of Pacific Islanders and Samoans do come up in a very powerful way in that novel. And I think, as a consequence of American racial politics and so on, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are often brought together into one category you know, voluntarily or not. And then there's also this model minority thing that Noelle brought up, which is imposed on and sometimes taken up by Asian Americans, which I don't think is often a very comfortable fit for a lot of Asian American populations or for Pacific Islanders and Samoans. I don't know if you want to talk about that, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, I think I can say some things about that. My father, I'm the son of an immigrant. My father came to the country actually on an American destroyer. His father, my grandfather, was a part of the first wave of Samoan immigrants who enlisted in the military in the 50s, a group called the Fugitives, and they arrived in Hawaii in the 50s, and so you know there were a lot of dichotomies that they had to deal with. For instance, they were vacating the Samoan Islands, where you know there has always been a legacy of Samoa, which is the Samoan way, and they were entering into an island which had been I should put it this way, whose indigenous peoples had been mixed in with other races, mostly Asian races, because of sugarcane fields in the late 19th century, where guys like Sanford Dole of Dole Pineapple brought in indentured servants from China, from Japan, Korea, Philippines, Portugal, the Azores, which are the islands in western Portugal, and even some Puerto Ricans, Russians. So Samoans were coming in the 50s after there had been kind of an established diversity of 2 or 3 generations of people moving off of the plantations and trying to sort of acclimate or raise their station, as it were. And that was one dichotomy that my family was dealing with. The second dichotomy, which is probably more austere and immediate, was that they were subjected to immigrant poverty, abject poverty. Even though the military had taken them on, the military didn't take care of them. This is the 1950s. And it's more, there's a kinship between the American military taking on Samoans. There's more of a kinship to something like the French Foreign Legion taking on foreigners, or you know, the British taking on the Punjabis. There's more of a relationship to that than there is within our country, because you know, my dad and his brothers and sister, they lived in serious poverty, meaning that they were eating out of dumpsters. My uncle used to tell stories about how they would wait for the colonel to go back into his house, and then they would steal the dog food out of the dog bowl. That's how my dad grew up, and that was his welcome to the country, despite the fact that his father, my grandfather, was in the military, was in the Navy. And then later, my father and his older brother actually enlisted in the military, and my dad did 3 combat tours in your native country, in Vietnam, as a special forces tracker. And I have 5 uncles who were in Vietnam in combat units, all voluntary units. So they had that experience, which was obviously intense and potentially ruinous for many of them. It's a complicated and potentially a difficult story, but also a good American story, in the sense that many people like that built the foundation of our story and solidified or substantiated what it means to be an American. You know, my family is very patriotic about the country. Samoans have the highest enlistment rate in the military still to this day, per capita. They're very patriotic, but my family also suffered terribly. I'm only sharing with you a tiny fraction of the stories, frankly, that I could tell about my family. And in fact, my dad's oldest brother, who was a Force Recon Marine, he was killed by police in 1976, the same way Eric Garner was killed by police. And he was a war hero. He was a Force Recon Marine. He's my dad's oldest brother. And, you know, it's sad that that type of story gets revisited on people, you know, and that they that type of story seems to recur frequently enough to remind you of these types of failures in our society.
Well, Peter, I hope you'll write about your family's experiences. You know, I think it's so crucial. You know, one thing to say about the model minority narrative that I think most people who are listening to this probably know, obviously, is that it elevates Asian Americans to the status of an ideal minority. You know, we come to this country, usually from a suffering Asian country, suffering from war, poverty, and we come here and despite various kinds of cultural hurdles, we become successful. So we are both evidence of some kind of Asian superiority, and we're also evidence of the American dream and American exceptionalism, that you can come from a poor country to a rich country like ours and go up the ladder of social mobility. And the two things that the model minority narrative contrasts with implicitly is the narrative of non-model minorities, those minorities within the United States that have not taken advantage of America's great bounty and become successful, meaning usually Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander populations. So the model minority narrative is very problematic in that regard because it continues to affirm the American dream and to turn our attention away from deep-seated structural problems in American society that have made it very difficult for people who have been colonized or brought to this country as slaves to overcome, right? And a lot of Asian immigrants don't understand that, as has already been mentioned. They come here and they can succeed, and then they wonder, well, why haven't Black, Brown, Indigenous, or Pacific Islander populations succeeded, without making the connection that the United States has socially engineered the importation of middle-class and elite Asians into this country who already came equipped to succeed here. And on the other hand, you know, there have been centuries of oppression directed against American-born Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples that are very difficult to overcome. But the other issue that Peter raises is, again, the explicit issue of colonization, that the Pacific Islands are a part of the United States because they were conquered by the United States, formally or informally colonized by the United States, whether we're talking about Samoa or Guam or Hawaii. I mean, you have to remember that Guam and Hawaii, a lot of Guam and Hawaii are owned by the US military. I mean, we conquered these places and have turned them into military bases for the domination of the Pacific. And Americans, you know, only think of these places as Pacific paradises without understanding that, for example, Hawaii and Guam were staging bases for the Vietnam War. I mean, B-52s were taking off from Guam to bomb Vietnam. And the only way that Americans, you know, the majority of them can make sense out of this is to not focus on the militarization of Hawaii and Guam and the incorporation of Chamorro and Samoan soldiers into the US military, but instead to think about places like Guam, to think of Hawaii as a paradise and to think of Guam as a rescue place, because a lot of Vietnamese refugees came through Guam to get to the United States. You know, B-52s took off from Guam to bomb Vietnam, and then Vietnamese refugees were taken in and taken to Guam, but Americans focused on the narrative of rescue instead of the narrative of militarization and bombing. So the model minority narrative that turns Vietnamese refugees into immigrants totally obscures this narrative of colonization that Peter is talking about. And so it's, you know, if we look at colonization instead of immigration, we have a very different narrative of the United States. The narrative of immigration gives us the American dream. But if we think about colonization, what we have to realize is that the United States is a colonized country. You know, Americans do not talk about this because it's completely antithetical to who we imagine ourselves as Americans. You know, it's the French, the British, those are the colonizers. You know, but we're the land of American exceptionalism. We don't do that kind of stuff, but it's not true. America is an example of a completely successfully colonized country, only we don't call colonization by that name in this country. We call successful colonization the American dream. These are the two flip sides of the American experience. And most Americans are completely socialized into embracing the American dream and forgetting the narrative of colonization. I'm going to make a couple of literary recommendations for people to read in the spirit of what Peter was talking about earlier. Craig Santos Perez is actually, he's Chamorro from Guam, but he migrated to Santa Clara, grew up there, and he wrote a quartet of books called From Unincorporated Territory, poetry dealing with the Chamorro experience, Guam, the military colonization of Guam. I highly recommend that. And then also another dimension of colonization that the United States has been involved with is the Philippines. The United States conquered the Philippines in 1898, formally colonized the Philippines until 1946. That's why a lot of Filipinos are here in the United States. That's why a lot of Filipinos serve in the US Navy. That's why we have so many Filipinos in our medical professions as nurses and doctors, right? But again, most Americans do not remember or know this history or think of colonization. So there is another great Santa Clara novel called America is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo, which I loved as well. And it, San Jose does come up in there, but mostly it's about Milpitas. Whoever thought a novel could be written about Milpitas, but it is about the Filipino experience of exile and then racism and assimilation into the United States in the 1980s during the martial law period in the Philippines. And again, remember, Ferdinand Marcos and martial law, we sponsored that. Ferdinand Marcos was our dictator in the Philippines. We supported a dictator in the Philippines because Ferdinand Marcos allowed the United States to use the Philippines as a bombing base for the war in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And we looked the other way while Marcos suppressed his own country. And we supported Marcos all the way up into the period of the People Power Revolution in the Philippines in the 1980s.
He even had an estate in on the windward side of Hawaii in the 80s. Marcos did.
Going back to your story of your family's role in the military, I know my family as well, the military was definitely it was a mode of upward mobility. It was a mode of finding a certain level of prosperity. But it also those stories made me think about the short story The Americans in the Refugees, where there's an African-American soldier, former soldier, and his Japanese American wife and their child, and going to visit her in contemporary Vietnam and her response and to living in Vietnam. And it made me think of, I wanted to get Iris Burke's question in, which was, please ask Viet, and I think I'd like to ask both of you, to discuss the source of stories in the book. Where were they people he knew? How did he select the vastly different topics to address in the Refugees? And I just want to ask both of you, what makes you feel like, oh, this is the character I want to write about? When does it click? And also, especially when you write outside of your own lived experience, like about an African-American veteran, or say the gay refugee in The Other Man, or from a woman's experience. I mean, when are you writing it and you feel like, especially when you're writing outside your own experience, when you feel like this feels authentic to me, or this feels done, complete, I'm going to send it into the world?
What do you think, Peter?
Oh, well, for me, I've had a variegated experience, based upon the story or the book or the novel. I have different approaches. For instance, with What We Are, I was literally writing that on the bus, the 522 line from Palo Alto to East Sano, and I was just, I would just stop at all these various spots that I'd identified as good writing spots, and so it was, and also it was written entirely by hand. I refused to use a computer, and so I would just write it by hand, and then later that night, go back and transcribe what I'd written. But insofar as your question about when do you know that a character is that you're beating on the right pulse for a character, I don't know. My thing is, I always will. I'll just give it a go. You know what I mean? I'll just. To me, there's something about fearlessness and like a blue collar work ethic where you have no choice but to go forward in the story. Other people didn't have the choice to do what they have to do, to work the job they have to work. So you, as a writer, if you're going to call yourself a writer, you have to basically sit down and do the work, you know. And plenty of writers before this generation of writers have talked about that in really poetic ways in Paris Review interviews, things of that nature. But for me, there is a sense that you have to give it a shot, you know, and you have to go forward on it. My thing was I would write 500 words every day since May of '99. That's what I was doing for about 20 years, and I've since stopped for the first time, and I haven't been able to write recently. But or I haven't written recently, I should say. But of course, what also happens is that you end up losing some narratives. You know, you don't stay with them all, and sometimes you write stories in your mind that by the end of the day you forget about. But I'm sort of a romantic about it. I think that those stories create a kind of saturation for future work. You know, it's ineffably, you know, building up stories in some way, shape, or form, and will affect the future narrative positively, even though you can't get it at that particular time. I somewhat think that if it's meant to be written by you with the authority that it's meant to be written, you will write it eventually with authority it's meant to be written, if it's meant to be written by you. This is a difficult time for a lot of young writers, I think, because they feel they're reluctant to. Some are reluctant to go forward because there are new. How can I put this? A lot of people talk about appropriation and cultural appropriation, gender appropriation, and things of that nature. And I'm actually in the middle of this issue because I actually view writing place and writing people as a moral matter. I'll explain how I'm in the middle of the issue. But on the one hand, I consider it a moral issue because literary writers gravitate towards stories that where there is suffering, where there's death, where people have been through crazy stuff. And this, you know, is evocative and it creates tension and confrontation, and that's what drives story. And so you gravitate to those types of stories. However, if you're from, you know, like, I don't know, if you're from, I don't know, Maine or something, you're not going to be able to write a story about Vietnamese coming up in the East Side in the late 70s or early 80s. You just don't have access to that. And so you know, there's a high level, there's an authentication issue, an authenticity issue at play here, because the people who lived those stories suffered. And so in my view, and this goes back to my own childhood actually, in which I was actually taught this by my father, and it just eventuated into a personal philosophy or aesthetic as a writer. You have to lift the narrative to the level of that type of suffering, like I was speaking about earlier with Long Nguyen's work, where if you don't get the blessing or the sign off from those particular people, then in my view, morally, you've actually failed the work, because the story exists without your intrusion cleanly and powerfully, and it has all the power inherent to it without your intrusion. And your intrusion could actually potentially mitigate the story, mitigate the power of the story, I should say. And so on the one hand, you have to meet that sense of authenticity. On the other hand, all writing is appropriation. And so, for instance, if I'm the first person protag in a particular story, or if I walk out of this house right now and I get involved in a story that I want to potentially write about later, and it's me, and I'm just recalling my own memories, I'm appropriating from my own experience. Because the person that you are as a writer, as a narrator, is not exactly the person who you are as a human being, obviously, because we grant the writer a license for huge amounts of empathy and plugging into experience, which makes it special to be a writer. And so, I mean, if we didn't have appropriation, for instance, you would never have The Red Badge of Courage. Stephen Crane, it's considered the best Civil War novel, but he wasn't even in the Civil War. In fact, I think he wrote it like 20 years after the Civil War was a wrap, and he put a bunch of newspaper clippings on his table and then wrote about it in hindsight. Or Marlon Brando did Vito Corleone, and I think he's from Nebraska, actually. and he played a Sicilian. He probably played the best Sicilian, Italian mobster role that we have in cinema. Appropriation, or how about this? What about a writer like, an actor like James Earl Jones? He's the first one to do Lear in Shakespeare in the Park in '76. So he's a brother, and he's doing Lear. Okay, so he's. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't lose the connection between the human experience. The reason I love Viet's book, The Refugees, is because it activates all kinds of reference points for me. For instance, when I'm reading about in the second story, I can't remember the protagonist's name, but he's the one that comes in and he lives with the two gay characters in San Francisco, and he says something to the effect of he's writing letters back and forth with his father and mother, and he's been sent ahead for fortune, and this is like the most consistent American story for refugees or for immigrants coming to this country, going all the way back to the late 19th century. In fact, I watched a film maybe a month and a half ago by Elia Kazan, who did A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront. And no one really knows this film because it's not one of his better works, but it's called America, America. And the whole story is this 3-hour agonizing tale of this guy being sent from the Greek-Armenian line in Turkey out to the United States, and the crazy stuff that he has to deal with. And I was thinking about that as this guy's in San Francisco, and I think it probably would have been the late 70s or early 80s. That's the power of storytelling to me, that you can connect in that way, and it's actually against the kind of cheap reductivism that goes on now in political discourse and in American discourse, frankly, through texts and tweets and the sort of the phraseology that is the dominant means by which people communicate. It's against that. Literature literature doesn't just plug into the human side of the story, but it also plugs into the layered ways in which we live as humans, and that doesn't exist in the surface way in which people communicate, usually via tech. I know this is off topic, so I'll stop there. Maybe not off topic.
I have a couple questions relating back to your to Viet's description of refugees. And Megan Gorman DeReef writes, I love the articulation of the refugee as opposed to the immigrant as a way to emphasize what was left behind, often as a result of U.S. foreign policy and its aftermath. Akili Mbembe has taken this up, choosing to use the term fugitives to draw attention to the fact that there is a hunt for those who are perceived to not belong in national spaces. I'm curious what you think of this term, or if you think refugees does more political work. And in a related question, David Mesher asks, is there a difference between refugee writers and exilic writers, other than those who self-identify as exiled and those who live in the U.S. Tend to write in languages other than English?
Well, Edward Said has a great essay on exile. And I think that for me, when I read Said's essay on exile, I think it's called Reflections on Exile, I thought that is not really me that he's talking about, because I identify as a refugee versus an exile. Just in the way that exile has been deployed in the contemporary period. I'm not talking about Jewish exile, but exilic writers. There's a sense of, I think, romance attached to the exilic writer. I'm not talking about the exile condition in general, just to the exilic writer. Sense of romance attached to that, but also a sense of sort of the modernist experience is attached to exile as well. Because exile is often conceived of, that term has been used in terms of writers as a very individualistic term. You can choose to be in exile in Paris, like so many African Americans exiled themselves to Paris in the 20th century, for example. Whereas the refugee condition is not really oftentimes about choice. It's oftentimes about, or it's not an individual experience, it's a mass experience. Thousands of refugees are moving, not just one or two exiles. So you can be exiled not by choice. For example, there are a lot of Filipinos who were exiled to the United States during the martial law period, but they didn't come in thousands. I think for the most part, they were coming in small groups or in ones or in families and so on. So I think there is a substantively different experience for those classified as exiles versus those classified as refugees. And it shows up in the literature because I think a lot of exilic writers, I can think of, like the German exiles of World War II. Those were very elite kinds of figures out there. Whereas there are a lot of refugees who do become writers or who do things like write oral histories or do co-written books. They don't have the veneer of elitism or of high culture with their works, because their works are considered degraded because they've written, co-written books or participated in oral histories, for example. And then the other question, the first one, if you can just prompt me once again on that.
I think she was talking about Mbeme's idea of
Fugitives.
fugitives. That's right.
I think the argument, the thinking about fugitives has taken off in the last few years, and a lot of it has been applied or come out of the experiences of slaves, people running away from conditions of enslavement and becoming fugitives and being hunted down. And so trying to translate that experience into some kind of a theoretical or perspective or a critical paradigm. And I think that, that can work, I think, for certain kinds of refugee populations. If we talk about, for example, Southeast Asia and the consequences of the war there, we look at what happened to the Hmong there. A lot of the Hmong the Hmong are population who live in Laos, who were also divided by the war. Some Hmong sided with the French and with the Americans. Some Hmong sided with the Vietnamese and the communists. The Hmong who sided with the Americans and who lost the war, basically, some of them were lucky enough to become refugees to the United States. Others literally became fugitives, running away from their Vietnamese and Laotian communist persecutors, and had to live in the forests and jungles of Laos as fugitives, right? And the story that Peter brought up about the Liam, the refugee who comes to the United States and discovers that he's gay in 1975. He's a refugee, but I think you could apply something of a fugitive narrative to him, because he starts to receive letters from home, from the family he's left behind, especially his father, asking him, what's going on? How are you doing? We need some help. And he's torn because he obviously wants to help them, but he's also not able to talk about who he is now to his family. He becomes a fugitive from his own family. So I think there is sometimes an overlap between these kinds of experiences, but that's not an exact, they're not always exact. And this is one last thing about what Peter was talking about in terms of imagination and empathy for the writer and why we write about different people. I think most of us write about different people all the time. So even if I write about Vietnamese people, yes, we're Vietnamese, it doesn't mean we're all the same. So we have to, the writer has to engage in imagination and empathy, just even to write about the people right next to them. Like, your parents are sometimes the most alien people in your life, even if they have all these other things in common with you. It takes tremendous imagination and empathy to write about them. And so it took imagination and empathy for me to write about, a Vietnamese professor who's 80 years old suffering from Alzheimer's. I don't have any connection to that. But sometimes it's very deliberate to write about people who obviously are not like us on the surface. So that's why it was important for me to write about in The Americans, from the perspective of an African-American bomber pilot, because I have no connection to either African-Americans or bomber pilots. And as a writer, I think sometimes we just want to demonstrate that we are not just writing about people who seemingly are like us. If white writers have the freedom to write about anybody they want to write about, so should we. It's oftentimes imposed on so-called minority writers that we only write about so-called minority populations, our own. And so we have to forcefully demonstrate that we can write about other people. And writing that story was challenging because, oftentimes when people do write about people who are not like them, it's really kind of awkward, because there's so many moments when the reader can clearly detect, oh, this writer is now trying to explain the circumstances of this other population by explaining a culture, explaining a custom, by pointing out the differences. So for example, in the first draft of that story, or the draft that was right before it was published, there is no mention made of the fact that James Carver is Black. I never used the word Black. or African American in this story. I thought, you know, if you are Black or African American and you were writing about yourself, would you at some point raise your hand and say, I'm Black, by the way? It doesn't happen. I mean, if you're a white writer, no white writers don't have to raise their hands and say, by the way, I'm writing about white people. You just assume the world that you're in. But if you are a so-called minority writer, oftentimes you're pressured by readers or editors to at least acknowledge the difference, even if you yourself don't feel yourself to be different. So writing from James Carver's point of view, I wanted to write about a Black man's experiences without ever saying that he was Black. And so what are the cues that might indicate to us that he's Black? So he's from, if I remember right, he's from Alabama. He has a rural background. He becomes a pilot, and he says, no one expected me to become a pilot. No one expected me to be here in this kind of place, and so on and so forth. And in the published version, there is one mention of him being Black. My editor said, okay, you know, maybe just say Black once in the story, just to orient readers. And so I conceded to that, but hopefully in a way that was not like waving my hand and saying, I'm Black, right? And likewise, there's another story in there. I can't remember the title of the story. The first story, Black-Eyed Women.
Black-Eyed Women, yeah.
Women, where the narrator, who's first-person narrator, never says, I'm a woman, or I'm a girl, or whatever. Gender is never mentioned. So, I mean, a lot of readers said to me, it took me like pages and pages to figure out that she is a she, in fact, because gender is never mentioned in the story. But of course you figure it out because of certain events that take place in the story. And so I think that is, when you write about people from another background, that's one of the most fundamental challenges. You know, try not to point out that you're writing about someone from a different background, whether it's gender or race or culture or something else. Let the reader figure it out from the story as it unfolds. Just as when I pick up a John Updike story, I know the dude is almost always going to write about white guys. It's just a given, you know. So you don't, and you already know that from the context and the stories and the clues, and that I think is one of the most basic, you know, artistic demands for writers who choose to write from another background. Don't number one, don't try to appropriate in some kind of stupid way, but also, you know, don't be clumsy in how you write about other people as well. And it's hard to do.
It did on Black-Eyed Women. I was imagining the narrator's voice as a man up until a point when she says I was a tomboy, and that's like the first time. And I realized yet again, I just went into that bias of like, if it's a man writing and it's a generic narrator, it's going to be a man. And Andrew Lamb's story, Grandma's Tales, is really good at getting people to, you know, kind of plays with the gender of the narrator all the way through and never gives you a hard and fast rule. Kind of like Toni Morrison's one short story, Recipient, does, like, has a character that's talking about race the whole time, about two girls of different races, and you never know which one of them is the narrator or which race is the narrator. So it reminded me of that, of like the way I need to be conscious of my own bias of assuming that the generic always gets to be white and male. But there's so many other pieces I read that you're right, retrain me to imagine that if it's generic, they're white and male. So I appreciate your pointing out that no, we don't normally like shout out our own gender or race when we're thinking about our own experiences. There's a lot of questions here that we haven't got to. Pretty much all of them are on the Vietnamese American experience. But one did ask, so I saw your comments directed at some of your Facebook posts. This is to Viet, where you mentioned that Ho Chi Minh expressed solidarity to Black social movements, even if this was a gesture in good faith. I would argue that his ideas and ideals on communism were very Western-centric, which is also part of empire building and is very colonial and violent. How do you understand these tensions? That's from Anna Nguyen.
So yeah, I posted that, and I knew that if I posted that, people would get all nervous, you know, because for a Vietnamese American to mention Ho Chi Minh in any way and not say he's the devil, a lot of Vietnamese Americans will say, you're a communist because you didn't call Ho Chi Minh the devil. And I think history is more complex than that. And what I was talking about there was simply to point out that Ho Chi Minh, in his efforts to become a revolutionary, had a very international perspective, and he connected the dots. He didn't just say, you know, we have to have a revolution in Vietnam against the French because we're Vietnamese. He said we have to have an international revolution against colonialism in general. And we have to be able to connect our experiences being colonized by the French in Vietnam with the way that the French have colonized North Africa and West Africa. And I thought that was really a crucial issue, and it totally is relevant today. You know, those of us of any kind of population, the natural incentive is to identify with our own population and to say we're oppressed, we're victimized in some way, and to focus on our experiences. Vietnamese people do that, everybody does that. Americans in general do that. But if we do that, we don't understand the social reality of our situation, that in fact, oppression, domination, power operates in a complicated fashion, that we're connected through multiple forms of oppression and privilege. So for example, to go back to the model minority narrative, model minority privilege in this country cannot be extricated from the fact that we're privileged, those of us who are classified as the model minority, we're privileged not to be colonized, we're privileged not to be brown or black in a country in which anti-black, anti-brown racism is much more systematic and much worse than anti-Asian racism. So we have to be able to connect the dots, and Ho Chi Minh did that. And so whatever you think of Ho Chi Minh and his politics and the fact that the man did do some terrible things, okay, it's important to acknowledge that he was able to make these Afro-Asian and international solidarities and connections happen, because a lot of Vietnamese people can't do it. They just focus on what was done to them, and then they don't have any sense of their connection to other kinds of colonized populations. And this became very evident to me because the sequel to The Sympathizer, The Committed, which is coming out in May 2021, delayed several months by COVID, is set in Paris of 1982 because I wanted to confront French colonialism. And so I went to Paris, talked to a lot of French of Vietnamese descent. And what was very clear to me after all these conversations is that for almost all the French of Vietnamese descent, they were happy. They liked being French of Vietnamese descent. Colonization in its history was not a problem for them, because in France, the French of Vietnamese descent are highly regarded by other French people for the same reasons of the model minority narrative. The French of Vietnamese descent are highly regarded because they are not Arabs, they are not Black, they are not Muslim. But none of the French of Vietnamese descent brought this up. They simply said, well, life is good for us here. The French like us because we're well adjusted. But they're well adjusted partly because they're not other kinds of populations. But the idea that they could connect their privilege to the French, deeply held colonialist and racist views of Arabs, Muslims, and Black Africans never arose. So bringing out Ho Chi Minh's ability to make these kinds of connections, I think is absolutely crucial. Now, how do we also address the other problems that were brought up in the question by Anh Nguyen about what Ho Chi Minh did that were bad, and about the role of violence and in anti-colonial revolutionary efforts? Because, Ho Chi Minh was very successful in obviously unifying anti-French opposition and liberating the country. And then, of course, he and his and people who followed him did some terrible things, like land reform, like killing off all their opponents. And eventually, the inheritors of Ho Chi Minh's revolution did things like build re-education camps where they put everybody who they defeated. So terrible things happened as a result of the anti-colonial revolution in Vietnam. And Vietnam was not unique. If we look at the example of Africa, the deployment of violence in African anti-colonial revolutions eventually has some really negative consequences in what triumphant African regimes did to their own people. And so the Committed takes up that issue. How do we deal with, the legacies of privileging violence in anti-colonial revolutions? It's a complex question. Hopefully the Committed will be able to offer some kind of an answer to that, because I take up, the key arguments about the violence and the necessity of violence in anti-colonial revolutions in Frantz Fanon's work, The Wretched of the Earth, and Black Skin, White Masks. But I also take up the question of what are the possibilities of nonviolent struggle. Fanon argued that it's necessary to be violent in deposing colonization because it's through the struggle of violence that we learn how to be free. And I think there is some legitimacy to that argument. But in The Committed, I posed a counter argument, which is it's also possible to learn how to be free through nonviolent struggle as well. And what would that entail?
another question that's directed at you, but I think both Viet and Peter could respond to this. It says, hi Viet, we have read, this is from Anatole Rousser. Hi Viet, we have read many of your articles, most notably your Time Magazine cover article, I Love America. It is great that you share your honest perspective of the amazing aspects of America, but more importantly, are honest about the realities of America as well. How do you deal with those close-minded critics who say, well, if you don't like it here, go back to your country, etc.? How do you deal with that type of ignorance? And I wanted to ask, Peter, you had been talking earlier about, you know, the great patriotism of your family, even as they experienced, you know, a very mixed reception. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on this.
Peter, by the way, Anatole is Bellarmine class of '88. He was one of my very few friends that I had at Bellarmine. We spent a lot of time together, and he was one of the Asian invasion at Bellarmine back then.
Okay, so he's here to harass you then. Fantastic. Well, I don't know if I've ever seen Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam. It's a pretty lengthy ordeal. I think it's about 18 to 20 hours, and he really immerses himself in the narrative of, or actually, narrative is a weak word in the war there. But the reason I say narrative is because it just didn't focus on the American war. It focused also on the French Vietnamese war, and even the wars after our departure, the American departure. But he interviews a woman there from North Vietnam who speaks to her how much she loves her country. And the reason this documentary, by the way, is so fantastic is because he not only accesses American troops, which you would get in any standard American documentary, but he also accesses South Vietnamese, the enlisted army from South Vietnam, and then also interviews former soldiers from the NVA and from and who are Viet Cong, and even just villagers from the north. So he plugged in. I think because of the time when he made the documentary, which was 14 and 15, I think, when relations, or how can I put it except to say that he had better access to people and to their stories. So at any rate, they asked this lady, you love your country, and can you tell us why or what? She says, well, I had 5 brothers, and all 5 brothers died in the war against the French. And then she said, I have 3 sons, and all 3 sons died in the war against the United States. And then Burns sort of transitions to the next segment. And that made me stop and think about her positioning and which she has no choice really but to truly, purely love her story, because she's lost everything. Although I wouldn't presume to analogize my own story to her story, my patrilineal line did suffer like that in some ways, and did face a lot of death and lost quite a bit to get to this country and to add to this country. So at the same time that there's the other thing is there's a lot of pride, a third world kind of pride, in which, because life is very physical, here in the United States, we live such a virtual world in which one's physical prowess, I would argue, is not prowess, but the ability to address the physical life on its physical terms. Well, that's the third world life. And so how does one do that? One does it with pride and with courage and strength and a conviction, and not making any excuses or anything of that nature where you rationalize what you're going through, because frankly, you don't have time for it. The suffering and the struggle is that profound and that real and that immediate, and it's searing, and it's at a molecular level to the parties involved. And so the short end of it, of what I'm basically trying to say, is that there is a duality to that type of experience for people like my uncle and my dad who enlisted in the military. My dad and my uncle enlisted in the military just to basically help their family out, to pay bills. My uncle was a UDT certified paratrooper at 16 or 17 years old. The UDT preceded the Navy SEALs. My dad was a Special Forces tracker, and to them, it was just an extension of the type of life that they were living. They lived that hardcore of a life before they went into the military, before they went into war. And so it was just a verification of the life that they were living. And they really didn't have any patriotic impulse to the extent that one might assume of people volunteering for the military. They not only volunteered, but they went back. And they went back a second and a third time. And my father was actually was awarded a Silver Star for Valor in a 12-hour battle, and he never collected the award. They mailed it back to my grandfather in Hawaii, and his explanation for that was that he's there to be with his brothers. His brothers were the 5-man tracker team that he loved, and they were from all different parts of the United States. And I met some of these guys, and they're beautiful guys. You know, they suffered tremendously also, and they had to basically one guy had to actually reconcile with the fact that he'd grown up in a sort of a racist setting. He's from Oklahoma, and he had to reconcile with the fact that the guy that was saving his life was some Polynesian guy, and that he has to eventuate into either loving that guy or friendly firing him, meaning capping him. My dad, he had to reconcile with that, and so he reconciled with that. And I talked with him personally in Bakersfield, California, in 2011. And he was actually surrounded by his grandchildren, because his kids had all married into Mexican families. And so and they're calling him Abuelito, Abuelito, crawling all over him. And it occurs to me that is the American story, and so it is complicated, and it's difficult, and it's and difficult is a weak word, but there is a chance for beauty, and there's a chance for I almost used the word camaraderie, but I don't want to be accused by anybody of being a communist. Since we're talking about Viet's books, but there's a chance for camaraderie. I will say that between people who otherwise would never even spend a minute together.
While we still have you here together, I wanted to turn more towards your representation of San Jose. Revati Krishnaswamy writes to, a couple people have written just to the panelists, and when you write to the panelists, we see it, but no one else does on the chat, so I just wanted to call up a few things. SJSU is building a digital story map of San Jose that will explore the city through literature and art. We are inviting authors connected to San Jose to contribute a short piece. I'd love to email Viet and Peter with details and an invitation. I hope they will consider contributing to the project. So that's Dr. Revati Krishnaswamy. And also, just to the panelists, Chris Meyercord wrote, "Thank you so much for those recommendations, Viet. Super helpful and important for those of us who are teachers. As you well know, kids light up when they see themselves reflected in what they are reading in school." So I thought I would share that with all of you. What do you think would be important in thinking about the literature of San Jose? You've talked a lot about, both of you have represented it in some way or form. And Peter, you were just talking about the way that your father bonded to all these people that were from all over the US. What do we, as such a multi-ethnic community, representing lots of different class levels, lots of different racial groups, what bonds us in this place? What do you see as the literature of San Jose being most important in representing San Jose?
I mean, honestly, I don't even know what the literature of San Jose is. That's why I'm saying when I read Peter's book, I was like, oh my God, there's a novel about San Jose, you know, because I had a very difficult time growing up in San Jose, and I just wanted to get out of honestly, I just wanted to get out of San Jose. It was my dream by the time I was in high school to go somewhere far, far away, because I just found San Jose so oppressive. And that had a lot to do with just being an adolescent, had a lot to do with growing up next to the freeway, you know, living in my parents' household, dealing with all the various stresses of refugee life. And then, you know, feeling that San Jose, I apologize to all the people who live in San Jose, but feeling like San Jose was like a cultural wasteland, that there was nothing here, that I had to go someplace else to find, you know, intellectual and cultural stimulation. And it's just a very harsh assessment of San Jose. I don't think it's a fair assessment of San Jose. I think almost everybody I know stayed in San Jose and loves San Jose, as far as I can tell, right? It's just me who has a problem with San Jose. So I have a very hard time writing about San Jose, because I have to get over these cultural and personal psychological blocks that I have, both about the city, but also the difficulty of writing about myself as well. Like The War Years, that short story in The Refugees, is the only autobiographical piece of fiction I've ever written. It was really hard for me to write, because so much of it dealt with the trauma of what it was like to grow up here for my parents and for me. So right now, I mean, I'm under contract to write a nonfiction book, and I realize that I have to write about San Jose. I have to write about what it was like to grow up next to the freeway and all the things that happened in that house, and the difficulties of my parents running the New Saigon mini market on Santa Clara Street, you know, and everything that it represents. You know, for those of you who don't know, I mean, my parents ran a grocery store on Santa Clara, I think between 3rd and 4th, for, you know, 10 or a dozen years, where they worked themselves constantly. Had a devastating effect on them, but also on our family life, obviously. Left me very emotionally deprived. And that store is very symbolic. It's very symbolic for me, because you all know exactly where it is, actually, because San Jose City Hall is right across the street from the site of my parents' store. And the fact that the city forced my parents to sell that store so they could build the new San Jose Symphony on that property, you know, was very important to me, because for 15 or 20 years, whenever I would go back to San Jose, number one, I hated going back to San Jose, but whenever I would go to downtown San Jose, I would never drive by that section of Santa Clara Street, because I did not want to see what had happened to my parents' store. You know, they had suffered so much there, and all that was left was a hole in the ground. It was a parking lot. No, actually, I thought it was a parking garage, but I never drove by, so I never knew what was there, until after the Pulitzer Prize, San Jose City Council decided to give me a prize, invited me back. And I'd never seen San Jose City Hall, because I was like, I don't want to go to this area. So I went back for the first time in like 20 years and realized that they never built a garage on my parents' property. It was a parking lot. And I learned later that the intention was to turn that parking lot into the San Jose Symphony, which I could actually reconcile myself to, because I thought of a Vietnamese grocery store being turned into the San Jose Symphony. I thought, that's wonderful. San Jose is no longer a cultural wasteland. It has a symphony. But then that never happened. And instead now, from what I understand, you know, they're building a very expensive condominium complex on the side of my parents' property. Yeah. And I think it's being built by a Chinese developer. So the whole narrative of America, to me, is just like there. You know, the symphony was never heard. Instead, we have a condo complex built by a Chinese developer on the site of a Vietnamese refugee store. That's what I got to write about. You know, it's very hard for me to confront that history, the emotional history there, and to talk about that, you know. So yeah, that's why I admire Peter, you know, because he could do something that I couldn't, which was to write. If you read Peter's novel, which I recommend you all do, he deals a lot with the fact that San Jose was a really screwed up place for a lot of people. And all of that has been erased, literally whitewashed, by the narrative of Silicon Valley. I remember, for example, when I was in college, a German journalist came to interview me and said, "Oh yeah, you're from San Jose. We think of San Jose as a multicultural utopia." I'm like, really? That's not my experience of San Jose, you know?
I have enjoyed talking with you both so much, and I'm afraid we have to wrap up, partly because we need to let our ASL interpreters go home. But thank you so much, and then thank you for all the questions you guys have submitted, all the audience. You've been great. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for giving us
very
a lot.
Don't leave just yet.
Thanks, Viet.
Okay, this is Deborah back again. Big thank you to Viet Thanh Nguyen. Next slide. To Peter Nathaniel Malae. Next slide, please. To Nicole Brada-Williams. Next slide, please. To the Yiddish Book Center for selecting SJPL as a grant recipient for the Coming to America reading groups for public libraries, and to Sharon Kamazin for funding this project. Special thanks also to Purple interpreters Genevieve and Farah, and to Rosemary and Steve Van Leer, without whose steadfast support and technological capabilities this webinar would not have been possible. For more information on the Yiddish Book Center and Coming to America, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org and my blog at San Jose Public Library, where all of the titles in this series await you. Thank you all of the panelists and the participants for joining us. Have a beautiful, beautiful day. Thank you all.
Thank you too. Thanks, Viet,
Everybody.
for the invite. Thank you.
It's good seeing you, Peter and Viet.
Nice seeing you too, Noelle. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for participating. Thanks for having us.
Viet, I'm going to write you, okay?
We'll do.
Okay.
It's so much appreciated. Thank you.